Welcome back to Convivial Conservation around the globe. I'm your host, Eliana, and in this episode, I'm very excited to dive into the intersections of peace theory and convivial conservation practice. Today, I'm joined by Elaine Hsiao, one of the contributors to the book Convivial Conservation from Principle to Practice. With her, we'll explore how different forms of peace, from negative to ecological, play out in real conservation settings and what that means for the future of inclusive and just conservations. But first, I'd like to introduce my guest. Elaine Hsiao is an assistant professor at the Kent State University School of Peace and Conflict Studies and chairs the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Commission on Environment, Economics and Social Policy theme on environment and peace. Much of her work seeks to address conflicts in conservation, conservation in places of conflict, and conflict resolution through conservation. Hi, Helene. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Today, we will talk about your chapter, Conviviality in Disrupted Socionatural Landscapes, and how it relates to convivial conservation approach. But before doing so, I'd like to tell for the audience who didn't really heard about convivial conservation, what is convivial conservation? And it can be defined as one stream in a broader river of movements that seeks to overcome the unsustainable and inequitable status quo by creating a more equal and sustainable world. And it does so by implementing a set of principles which are listed in its manifesto, which we will explore during this conversation. And this podcast aims to better understand convivial conservation by seeing how these notions of convivial conservation work into practice and how we can put convivial conservation into context. And for this reason, I will now discuss with my guest Elaine how her chapter relates to convivial conservation. So, to start off right away, I would like to ask you if you could give a brief summary of your chapter in the case study, and what are the historical and conservation context of the area you researched.
Sure. So this was a paper that was based out of some research in Rwanda's Akagera National Park, which sits on its eastern border with Tanzania. And the idea was to actually look at some of the conversations in that area around human wildlife conflict management and to think about how that applies to actually realizing convivial conservation. So if we're thinking about conviviality as that day-to-day ability to coexist between humans and non-humans, then being able to manage the conflicts between humans and other than human species becomes really, really important.
Yeah.
And a lot of times also convivial conservation, I think the tension focuses on that boundary line between the conservation area and then the area which is not conserved.
Yeah.
And this is that human wildlife interface often in these kinds of landscapes. So, focusing on human wildlife conflict management in a park boundary, that is
Yeah.
where you encounter local communities who've been settled there, as a post-conflict kind of refugee resettlement process, was really, really interesting. So it's, you're trying to work with people or talk to people who are recreating life after war and genocide, and trying to recreate that with species at a park interface. So I think that was part of the interest in looking at Akagera National Park in Rwanda, and to be thinking about conviviality like that. Because I think in these types of socio-natural, disrupted landscapes, that's actually something which applies to the whole world. And so if you can think about it in the Akagera context, you can think about how it might apply in other spaces as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I read your chapter and I thought it was really interesting how you first, and that's actually my second question, as you first kind of discuss this theory of peace. No, you give these different examples of negative, positive peace, liberal and ecological, and then you actually put it in practice. So actually, my next question was to understand how you describe these different terms of peace and
Mhm.
how do they connect to idea of convivial conservation?
In the peace studies world, there's this Johann Galton's theory of peace, which
Mm.
centers around negative peace versus positive peace. And if we're defining that, very kind of textbook wise,
Yeah.
peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the absence of violence. And so conflict is seen as something which is inherent and necessary and important actually for life. And so this is why I think, again, it applies to conviviality, because you can't have this, conflict-free coexistence,
Yeah.
in real life, right? So it's all about how you actually manage that conflict. And with peace, it's, this, what you're trying to strive for is that freedom from violence. And we think about in the theory world, violence from three perspectives. It's either the direct or indirect violence, and it's the direct violence is physical violence, and then the indirect forms of violence are your structural violence and your cultural violence. So the physical violence is the thing we're most commonly connected to, which is, somebody hits you, that's physical violence. The one that's kind of like big in the zeitgeist of the world right now is structural violence, right? It's
Yeah.
social injustice, all of the systemic ways that people experience inequality or deprivation or oppression, etc. So that's your structural violence. And then cultural violence is all of those, the values, the belief systems, et cetera, that underpin and underlie and become the reasoning and the rationale for either that physical violence or the structural violence that then exists. So with negative peace, you're refraining from physical violence. You've stopped the bombing in the war, right? There's an armistice. There's a kind of moment of we will not shoot each other, right? And that's negative peace. So you've ended physical violence, but the cultural violence and the structural violence can still be present. Yeah. So positive peace is really striving to achieve freedom from all three forms of violence. And that's where I think, again, conviviality, connecting that to conviviality, I think is interesting, because you can think about conviviality as negative peace, or you could really strive for that thriving form of conviviality, where we actually have positive peace.
I really like the way you explained it. I think it's not really common to see conservation like that, with this terms of yeah, connecting to this theory of peace. So I really liked it. And I think I don't know if I'm right, but maybe the mainstream conservation tries always to solve the first, right, the first type of violence, right, and then it kind of fails in achieving this positive peace that instead wants to solve both the physical conflict but also the more cultural conflicts. So I see how convivial conservation can be more of the second type of peace. So that was really interesting. But you actually then in your chapter try to put these ideas of peace in actual conservation strategies. So I would be really interested for the audience to understand how these terms of peace actually translate in.
So in the paper, I look at kind of three generic forms of human wildlife conflict management. And so one of those is your classic barrier mechanism, which is separation, right? In the case of Akagera National Park, what they have is an electric boundary fence on all the perimeters, pretty much all of the perimeters of the park that don't have water. So the eastern boundary of the park is actually a river, the Kagera River, and it's also the border with Tanzania. So that then becomes outside of Rwanda jurisdiction. And it forms a natural boundary line that prevents most species from crossing anyway. And then the rest is electric fence. And in some places they might have long ditches, but for almost the entire park is fenced. So that's your physical structural barrier, right? And that's the classic one of the ways to create negative peace, right? It's your fences make good neighbors kind of approach, which is each one stays on their side and everybody's happy.
Yeah.
The second sort of human wildlife conflict management approach that I looked at was the compensation scheme. The mechanism that the park has, actually the government, created by law, that some portion of the park revenues and things like that get dedicated to a fund, basically, that community members who experience quote unquote human wildlife conflict management, they can request compensation for losses. And that's usually loss of, livestock, damage to property, and in very rare and very, very rare cases, especially now with that fence, death to humans. So that's what I would think of as your liberal peace approach, right? And liberal peace theory, to kind of very overly simplify it, is essentially the sort of economics-driven approach to peace. And so it's this idea that if you have economic exchange and engagement, that will incentivize people to retain positive relations.
Right.
Yeah, and so this is, you pay off the communities, right, for the damages that they incur, but this incentivizes them. And then it also takes other forms, right? It's not just the compensation mechanism, but there's all kinds of investment in quote unquote community development, money, given to communities to develop projects that help them coexist, right, with wildlife. And then the third bucket of sort of human wildlife conflict management approaches is your sort of traditional local ecological knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge. We're thinking about those umbrella academic terms, and cultural systems of relating to other species and the kinds of norms and practices that exist around understanding how to actually coexist in space. So that was what I kind of pitched as the positive peace approach, because in general, it's using nonviolent mechanisms. It's based on cultural systems and practice, which gets at that cultural violence aspect of peace theory that a lot of the others don't necessarily address.
Right. And all these different forms of conservation are actually practiced in the park, basically.
Yeah. So all of these are present in Akagera National Park, at different levels. So, the barrier mechanism is the one that was heavily invested in.
And
like
for everywhere else in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the barriers and the fencing of protected areas is increasing around the world, especially as people are losing, I think, access to that third category of sort of the cultural approach, the positive ecological peace approach. They're losing cultural knowledge around interspecies cooperation and coexistence. Yeah, and then the liberal peace approach is expensive. It requires constant capital and financial input. So in a time, let's say, like when this research was happening, COVID, during the pandemic, if the tourism stops, your revenues stop coming in. And so, you either have to find that money from somewhere else in your national budget or in the
it's
park
not as
budget.
effective.
Yeah, it's a little bit insecure. And then there's always that, the many challenges around this sort of economic incentives, is when, is the economic incentive enough, and will it ever be enough? All of the many reasons. Liberal peace is not always effective in the long term.
Yeah, I think here again, we see how convivial conservation can be seen as this third kind of conservation strategy, as one of the points actually of the manifesto states that Convivio try to challenge these dominant perspectives, to incorporate non-Western diverse worldviews and forms of knowledge into research and also decision-making processes, which, it seems like, as you were explaining, this positive ecological piece compared to this liberal or negative piece. So it seems it really connects very well with your case study.
So with conviviality and convivial conservation, one of the other critiques, and I wanted to link this to the liberal piece a little bit. One of the critiques is that if we have this kind of protected areas and non-protected areas and this basically human wildlife species apartheid kind of situation going on, and then relying on those financial mechanisms to incentivize that separation and coexistence, then you're really not getting at the underlying kind of one of the critiques that convivial conservation offers as a counter to the sort of half-earth approach,
Yeah.
which is that, you know, it's really that growth-based capitalism and extractive industries that are, you know, destroying all of the rest of the earth that's not protected, that will always undermine the protection that's happening inside of the protected areas of the conservation. And so if you don't address basically that, you know, the capitalism, right, and the liberal peace approach, right, to kind of coexistence between protected areas and unprotected areas, then we don't actually address the problem. And so then again, like, you don't get to positive peace.
Yeah. You just
Yeah.
address the things that you see, but not the underneath cause of, the
And in
the
a
actual
way, you're contributing to that system, which is destroying and undermining, right? You're contributing to that capitalist liberal, you know, liberal
Exactly.
economy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, I completely agree. And in fact, the first point is that of the manifesto is actually trying to promote these integrated areas where human and non-human coexist, right? Instead of having protected areas, have instead areas where humans and non-humans coexist peacefully. So yeah, exactly what you were saying. And yeah, and kind of moving from a economic growth to actually economic degrowth. It's also really important. So yeah, really ties very well. If you have any general final considerations after you ended up your study, your research, what are some considerations that you have in order to maybe reach a more convivial conservation?
One of the main things that needs to be rescued in this scenario is that cultural ecological knowledge, or culturally based ecological knowledge, which is often localized, and in some cases maybe even endemic, right? And so in the paper, there's a little bit of snippets from a conversation with a couple of elders in a village. And they had actually moved from other places. So they didn't grow up there, and that's not their ancestral lands. And so we're not talking about indigenous ecological knowledge in that same sense that this is like millennia and many generations of kind of co-created coexistence and knowledge derived from that. But it's people who, in the places that they had been displaced to. So in one of the cases to Tanzania, they lived in an ecosystem that was also kind of lots of wetlands and had hippos. And so what the village elder then said is that, you know, when he moved to the southern part of Akagera National Park, his community was dealing again with sort of crop raiding and the endangerment, sometimes to human life, from hippos in the Akagera wetlands. And, you know, he took the knowledge that he had learned from living with hippos in Tanzania and taught, you know, the other villagers in his community how to construct platforms to protect, you know, the fruit trees and the crops and things like that. And he also was able to explain to them the behavior patterns of the hippos so that they could, you know, kind of adapt their patterns and activities around that and be better prepared for when the hippos might come and crop raid or things like that. And also just to avoid them if that might be important for safety issues. So, you know, there's this translatable and transferable ecological knowledge that's important. And it still exists and resides with a lot of people. And it's not always about, have you had a long and indigenous and or ancestral claim to this land? And so I think one of the really important things is revitalization of culturally based ecological knowledge and locally, you know, appropriate ecological knowledge, and sharing that, right? And when it happens when you construct the fences and you pay people off for the damages that they experience from wildlife, is that they're not encouraged to utilize those mechanisms, and the knowledge gets lost.
Right.
And the knowledge gets lost when, you know, like in this context, you're talking about the displacement and mass displacement of human communities and wildlife from violent and armed conflict, and the resettlement of those people and places. And so I think there's, you know, a policy that could focus around reclaiming that kind of information, and also integrating that into park or conservation education systems, into basic education systems, would be really helpful for people to actually be able to understand. I mean, imagine if we all go to, most of us in institutionalized education kind of cultures go to school maybe by age 5, and imagine that at that point you're taught how to actually identify and understand the behaviors of all the species that live around you and how to mitigate non-violently the interactions that you have around with them. That would be incredible, right?
Yeah, that would be very useful as well.
It would change our interaction with our ecosystem, because right now we grow up actually knowing very little about what exists around us and how to behave when we're around certain animals.
Yeah, that idea would be actually amazing to try it out, I think. And do you know if any of these measures, like, is there research trying to kind of include this in decision-making, policy-making processes?
Yes, I have to be very honest and say I don't know too much about it because it's not my area, but I do know that there are, what I think of as kind of like your animal behavioralists,
Right.
the people who study animal behavior and or species behavior, and they understand that much better, and it's being integrated more and more, I believe, into human wildlife conflict management as a way to, find alternatives to barrier mechanisms and or, sometimes the actual removal of what's considered a problem animal. And by removal, in the paper, we talk about the actual translocation of elephant species very violently. And if, people have seen in the news, there was another situation similar that turned out to be very violent very recently. So this is not about, technology helps us to do this better. It's like translocation is violent and traumatic for species.
Definitely.
They can actually prevent the need for that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I guess then you will have another sort of conflict, like conflict between the mainstream conservation or liberal conservation and then this kind of more convivial conservation. So that, that would be something else that needed to be explored, I think. But
and I think that's what makes this context interesting, right? These humans were settled in this place where actually people didn't really live before. And so the human wildlife conflict is entirely or largely what I would consider manufactured. It was created. It's a circumstance that has been produced. And so, it's like being able to figure that out, that coexistence and the messiness of it in this situation, I think is important. And that's what convivial conservation will look like in the end, I think is quite messy. But again, this idea of peace is not about there's no messiness, that there's no conflict. It's about how do you manage it.
Yeah, and how you coexist with this. So, exactly. I really like that last sentence, because sometimes you hear, yes, I don't want to talk about conflict, but it is a conflict kind of situation that you have to try and not solve it, but try and manage it, right? So yeah, exactly. So I completely agree with your point of view. So thank you so much for sharing it. Amazing. So that was actually my last question. I don't know if you want to add anything, any more considerations. Otherwise, that is the end of this episode. All right. So thank you so much, Elaine, for sharing your reflections and experiences. And your chapter offers so much food for thought on how we define and build peace within conservation work. So thank you so much again, and wish you all the best for your future projects. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
If you liked this episode, make sure to stay tuned for new episodes, which will be released soon. And if you want to know more about convivial conservation, make sure to check out our website, Convivial Conservation, where you can also find more information about our manifesto. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.